The world's ancient wisdom shows that parasite behavior is immoral and brings about its own downfall, and the gods are against it, devouring the resources of nations given to those nations by the gods, and devouring the men and women that the gods have allowed to be born into those nations. That's parasite behavior. I've talked about the Cyclops. He devours the crew of Odysseus. The Cyclops have no industry. They don't build any ships. They don't improve the gifts that are given to them by the gods whatsoever. They just devour others. Also in the Odyssey, the suitors who are devouring the household of Odysseus. They spin false narratives to cover over and try and excuse what they're doing. In fact, to try and say, oh no, we're not doing anything wrong, when in reality they are plotting to kill Telemachus. While they're devouring the household of Odysseus, they're plotting to kill the son of Odysseus and sleep with Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. But they act and they talk as if, oh no, we're the most upright, we're moral. Anyone who accuses them of doing something wrong, they try and turn it around and say, no, we're the ones who are in the right, you're the ones who are in the wrong. But we see again, the gods despise that kind of behavior. It is morally bankrupt, and it will come to a bad end. Eventually, that moral bankruptcy brings about its own downfall. There's finally a parasite apocalypse, a destruction of those parasites by Odysseus, inspired by the goddess Athena and assisted by his son Telemachus. Odysseus destroys all those parasites. Finally, he has to actually kill them because they won't listen to reason. They won't listen to the will of the gods. They are violent, devouring parasites. And although they talk like they're peaceful and friendly, they are actually violent. They're plotting to kill Telemachus. We see that very clearly. So here's an illustration from an ancient vase, an ancient Greek vase with artwork from about 440 BC, or if you prefer 440 BCE, showing Odysseus slaying the suitors. Now, what is so important to notice about this, and I've talked about it before, but I'll point it out again, this is a celestial scene. The whole Odyssey, like all the other ancient myths, is built on celestial metaphor. Built on celestial metaphor. And here we see Odysseus slaying the suitors. Notice the posture of the suitors corresponding to constellations in the zodiac. This is the outline of the zodiac constellations. Starting on the far right of the screen, we can see a suitor who is reclining on a couch. And he's got one arm up, but he's in kind of a recumbent posture. The constellation Virgo, the Virgin, is recumbent in the sky, appears to be seated or reclining on a couch with one arm extended. And the suitor on the far right is very clearly in the posture of Virgo. In front of that outstretched arm, there's a suitor who's very extended at a specific angle that matches up with the constellation Scorpio. That suitor is shown being shot by one of the arrows of Odysseus, by the way. The other suitor is putting up his hand saying, no, stop, Odysseus. We're your friends. They're not his friends. They're trying to kill his son and sleep with his wife. But that suitor, that extended suitor at that specific angle, he matches up perfectly with the constellation Scorpio. And in between Virgo and Scorpio in the sky, in the zodiac, is the zodiac constellation of Libra, the scales or the balances, which in the sky looks like basically a triangle with two beams coming down from it, or two legs. And in between the Scorpio and the Virgo suitor, we see a third suitor crouching down holding a table with two, kind of a double top and two legs, one on either side. That is Libra. Now, pointing a bow at Scorpio in the sky, if you look at the zodiac outlines, we see the constellation Sagittarius right there pointing the bow right at Scorpio. That is, of course, in this illustration, this ancient artwork, Odysseus himself is in the posture of Sagittarius. He's even holding the bow at the same angle as Sagittarius in the sky. So this is clearly a celestial scene. I've written an entire book where I go through the Odyssey and show that it is matching up. The action and the characters in the Odyssey and in the Iliad match up with constellations, specific constellations, and they tell a specific story. They are illustrating specific truths for us. Right now, the truth that I'm talking about is this apocalypse of the parasites. Their own immoral behavior is hateful to the gods. It may seem like they're winning. The suitors certainly seem like they've got everything under control. Telemachus and his mother, Penelope, are at their wits' end. They've pretty much given up. They think to themselves, we'll never get rid of these suitors. But their immoral behavior is hateful to the gods, and it carries the seeds of its own destruction, the apocalypse of the parasites. Now, very interesting in this ancient artwork, in between Sagittarius and Scorpio in the sky is a very important constellation called Ophiuchus. I'll outline it here. Ophiuchus is the serpent holder. It has this oblong central body, and then on either side are the two serpent halves. One half is typically known as the serpent's tail. One half is the serpent's head. Notice in between Sagittarius and Scorpio, in this vase itself, where the handle is, you can see those two circles. That's where an actual handle on this vase was placed on the vase. But there's this flower pattern, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. It's got this flower on just one side corresponding to the side on Ophiuchus that has the serpent's head, which sometimes plays a flower or a lotus in different myths around the world. That is Ophiuchus in between Sagittarius and Scorpio. This is a celestial scene. The ancient myths warn against parasites. They say this Wendigo parasite spirit is very dangerous. One of the whole purposes of rightful government is to drive out parasites, to prevent parasite takeover. Odysseus is the rightful king. He's not a parasite. When he goes to visit his aging father, his father is out working in the vineyards, even at his advanced age, producing industry, taking the gifts given by the gods in nature and the gifts given to men and women to improve society. And that's what industry is. Parasites don't do any industry. They just devour the resources of others, and they devour others. The ancient wisdom was very clear about this, but there was a catastrophe in which the ancient wisdom was overthrown by parasites. Basically, parasites latched on to the ancient wisdom, turned it on its head, and tried to stamp out this message, tried to stamp out the message that it was telling about prevention of parasites. And specifically, that happened with the texts, the stories of what we today call the Bible. The Bible, the books, the stories, the characters in the Old Testament and New Testament, they are based on the stars, just like all the other myths around the world. They're part of the same system. But a certain group, or a couple of different groups, took these stories literally and inverted their message. Instead of being about preserving nations and preventing parasites, they took these as a supremacist message of we're better than everybody else. We can go around, nations don't matter. We can devour them and take their resources and devour other men and women. That's a parasite message. The parasites hijacked the stories of the Bible. These nation-devouring supremacists took the stories of the Bible and said, no, these stories are not celestial. They're literal, and they're true, and everybody else's stories are false. And they took the stories of the Old Testament and the stories of the New Testament. Some groups just use the stories of the Old Testament, some groups the stories of the New Testament, but they are nation-devouring supremacists who say, because these stories are literal, we're better than you, and nations don't matter, and the ancient wisdom of other nations needs to be stamped out. Here's an illustration of Moses crossing the Red Sea, a familiar story from the Old Testament. It is celestial. I've done a whole course called the Celestial Bible Tour. You can buy those different courses all together, or you can buy the individual lessons if you want. The story of Moses and the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea is celestial. And in this illustration, we can see Moses in the center. On the left side is, again, a horse figure that is corresponding to Sagittarius. Sagittarius is a horse and his rider. There's a specific text that says the horse and his rider has been cast down in the crossing of the Red Sea. And that's Sagittarius, the Egyptian army pursuing. They're bogged down in the mud of the Red Sea. And on the other side of Moses, we see the children of Israel in the specific angle of the constellation Scorpio. In fact, if you look at on the left side of that image, you can see kind of kneeling figures, and then up at the top, arms outstretched. It is in the form of Scorpio. The body of the Israelites, the mass of Israelites, are arranged just like the constellation Scorpio. And in between them is, just as in the sky, in between Sagittarius and Scorpio, we find Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, that is Moses. Moses with his staff, his extended staff. Ophiuchus figures often carry either a staff or a spear. Notice that Moses, his rod or staff, turns into a serpent, just like the serpent halves of Ophiuchus, arranged in between Sagittarius and Scorpio, and in fact, right along the path of the Milky Way. The Milky Way is the Red Sea that the children of Israel cross in this story. It is celestial metaphor, and Ophiuchus looks like the constellation itself is holding out a staff into the Red Sea, and right there where the staff of Ophiuchus is pointing into the Red Sea of the Milky Way, there is a feature known as the dark rift, which goes across the Milky Way. That is the crossing of the Red Sea. But if you take this story literally, then you can say, well, some people are descended from Moses and they're more important than other people. That is a literalistic inversion of the story. Same thing with the New Testament. You have groups taking the New Testament stories literally. They are also celestial. In this image here, Jesus on the cross corresponds to Ophiuchus. And we see a figure on a horse spearing Jesus in the side. That's corresponding to Sagittarius. Down at the foot of the cross, we see another figure at that specific angle of Scorpio on the other side of Ophiuchus from Sagittarius. Now, Jesus, of course, in the stories is crucified in between two thieves. That's because Ophiuchus has these two serpent halves. You can see the illustration here. The two thieves are very contorted and twisted, and one of them has a bald head that corresponds to the serpent head on Ophiuchus. And just in case you think this is too much of a stretch, here's a different illustration where down at the foot of the cross we have a horseman riding a horse with multiple Scorpio images on the actual horse and on a shield next to the horse at the foot of the cross on the Scorpio side. So these are celestial stories, but they were taken literally and used for a supremacist parasite takeover. Nations were devoured by these transnational supremacist literalists who said, no, our stories are true, everybody else's stories are false. And basically what happened was the Roman Empire and the ancient world was destroyed by these literalists, and then they went around Europe and the Mediterranean stamping out the received wisdom of all the other cultures and setting up feudalism. This is an illustration of Charlemagne converting the non-Christian population of Europe at the point of a sword. You can see the figure on the horse, that's Charlemagne. He's pointing to a cross, and then the people of Northern Europe here are, the men are bound with their hands behind their back, and they're going to be given a choice of either get baptized or get run through with a sword and die. That's how Christianity spread. It's a supremacist, nation-devouring, resource-devouring worldview, and it is transnational. It doesn't respect the nations. It doesn't respect the gods, obviously. That is the story of the fall of the ancient world, and it brought the Dark Ages upon Europe as these parasites set themselves up in castles all over Europe and subjugated the population and basically lived off of the industry of others, not doing any industry for themselves. And later, they instituted colonialism and spread their tentacles to other continents around the world, stamping out the received wisdom given to those cultures and devouring their resources. During the 1700s and 1800s, however, nation-states started to throw off the power of these literalist churches and start to move away from a parasite-based feudal system. And things were moving in that direction, but the parasites fought back. The United States, for instance, was a rejection of the European colonialist system. And it was moving in a direction away from that for a while. But the parasites basically took over America. They don't care about nations. It's not like the City of London bankers care about the people of England or Scotland. They can jump over to Wall Street and run the same game out of the United States using the United States. But something has changed, and that is that some of those formerly exploited nations have finally become strong enough to resist the parasites. The parasites jumped from Europe as their base to the United States of America as their base and used it to run this exploitive parasitical system. They desperately want to jump to the new rising economic power of China. And the way they're trying to do that is by putting pressure on Russia to break it apart using the Ukraine. The goal was to goad Russia into this military operation against the Ukraine, then to put these crushing sanctions on Russia and break it apart. And from there, to run that same game that they ran with the Ukraine putting pressure on Russia. From there, they want to use Russia, breaking it apart, putting it under the control of these Western parasites, and break apart China. That's their goal. That's exactly what they've been trying to do. You can look at the news articles when they were slapping all these sanctions on Russia. It was absolutely a fever pitch in the United States in 2022 when Russia began its special military operation against the Ukraine. There was this blizzard of, we've got to sanction Russia. Oh, they're so evil. Don't even listen to Tchaikovsky. Don't even watch any Russian ballet. That's how rabid the calls to sanction Russia were. And there were all these articles proclaiming, oh, Russia is going to fall apart. It's going to disintegrate. Here's one by a descendant of Ukrainian immigrants to the United States. He's a professor at Rutgers, saying the Ukraine war might really break up the Russian Federation. It's time to start taking the potential disintegration of Russia seriously. There was a whole chorus of these voices. Here's the Jamestown Foundation, a military defense-oriented think tank, publishing a book called Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture, which was published in 2022 and written by a former Polish citizen who immigrated to the United States in the 1980s, Janusz Bugajski, attempts to transform the Russian Federation into a nation-state have failed. Stifling international economic sanctions will intensify and accelerate the process of state rupture. They're so sure that Russia is going to fall apart. The Hudson Institute ran a seminar called Preparing for the Dissolution of the Russian Federation, in which they invited a member of the Ukrainian parliament and this aforementioned Janusz Bugajski. Or here's another one from the Foreign Policy magazine, The West is Preparing for Russia's Disintegration. That was written in early 2023. Russia's poor performance on the Ukrainian battlefield has emboldened Western analysts and Russian dissidents to publicly call for decolonization of Russia itself. Isn't that ironic? Just one more example from 2023, written by Diane Francis, entitled Russia Will Collapse. She's the editor of a newspaper in Canada owned by Conrad Black. She says Russia hurtles towards another state collapse. The issue is not whether Russia will break up, but when and how. Clearly, the center will not hold, and Russia, as currently constituted, is likely to unravel. This was their plan. It failed utterly. The sanctions completely backfired, and Russia was not performing badly on the battlefield. In fact, what the Ukraine special military operation showed is that these financial parasites who deindustrialized the West, Wall Street, they shipped industry off to China, and I think their plan was to jump, after they'd hollowed out the United States and the West, to jump over to China. That's what they were trying to do, break up Russia on the way to breaking up China and getting their teeth in there, because Wall Street and Western banks are not allowed into China. And they want in so badly. They are trying so hard, but they're breaking their teeth against Russia because the West is unable to fight an industrial war. And that is what the Ukraine operation has shown. All the weapon systems that the Western countries, that NATO and the United States have been sending to the Ukraine have been shown to be inadequate on the battlefield. They are out of date because this deindustrialization, this financial hollowing out of the West, has left the West unable to fight an industrial war. Just last week, Donald Trump was addressing the West Point class of 2025 at the West Point graduation, and he said some things that highlight this dilemma. It's not the fault of the people, including those who join the Army. They're well-intentioned. For the most part, they're well-intentioned. They believe in protecting their country. But the real problem is they've been hollowed out by parasites on Wall Street, parasites who just want to devour, deindustrialize, like the Cyclops, like the suitors. And this speech is very revealing. I'll put together a few clips and highlight a few things.
Congratulations. It's a big honor. 8 cadets here today took on the challenge of designing their own hypersonic rocket. Oh, we can use you. Building them right now. You know, we had ours stolen. We are the designer of it. We had it stolen during the Obama administration. They stole it. You know who stole it? The Russians stole it. Something bad happened. But we're the designer of it. We're now building them, lots of them. Because believe it or not, you're in a business profession where things change as rapidly like warfare, the type of warfare. Unfortunately, we're getting to see it with Russia and Ukraine. And we're studying it, and it's a very terrible thing to study. But we're seeing the different forms of warfare. We're seeing the drones that are coming down at angles, with speed and with precision. We've never seen anything like it. Never seen anything like it. And we're learning from it.
Notice he said hypersonic weapons. He calls them hypersonic rockets. Russia has generations of hypersonic weapons. The West has been unable to demonstrate successfully any hypersonic weapons whatsoever. Hypersonic weapons meaning they travel at over Mach 5. Russia now has weapons that travel at Mach 9, Mach 10. And in that speech, Trump says, well, they stole that technology from us. Russians stole it. Well, even assuming that that's true, it's actually laughable because, again, the United States has not been able to demonstrate successfully any hypersonic weapons. But just assuming that the Russians did indeed steal the design back in the Obama administration, that's what Trump alleges in this speech, they've been able to actually build and demonstrate those weapons. They've got industry to do it. The West may have had the design, but they don't have the industry. Their industry has been hollowed out by financial parasites, by this parasite system. Also, you heard Trump talk about drones coming in at angles and with precision and speed that, he doesn't say it, but Western air defense cannot stop. The Western air defense systems are obsolete. The United States is still using Patriots. Those were old when I graduated from West Point in 1991. They were already an old system. The same generation Russian system that was designed around the same time period was called the S-300. They've now upgraded the S-300. The West has upgraded the Patriot. But the Russians have created the S-400, a whole new generation, and they've also created and successfully fielded the S-500. In the West, the de-industrialized West, the United States is still just kind of upgrading this obsolete Patriot system, and it doesn't have the capability of detecting drones and stopping missiles coming in at a high angle, or it can't detect them far enough away. This is an illustration of the different envelopes where the Patriot system and its upgraded PAC 2s and 3s can detect and try and counteract drones and enemy missiles versus the S-300, S-400. This doesn't even show the S-500. But you can see they have a very hard time with a steep close-in angle and also with a far coming in from a low angle, whereas the Russian systems don't. Russia, China, and Iran, they all have hypersonic weapons. The West so far has yet to demonstrate, and that's because of the parasites hollowing out the industry. It is an immoral approach that the gods hate, and it carries with it the seeds of its own destruction. And that is what is going on right now. That West Point speech is giving you hints that the Western deindustrialization has come up against industry that it cannot counteract. And so the parasites are stuck. This is actually good news for the people of the world. The primary role of government, whether it's a monarchy or whether it's a democracy or whether it's a republic, its goal has to be to prevent parasite takeover. And that's what in the 1700s and the 1800s, even in the West, economists and philosophers were starting to understand. They were rejecting the parasite-driven system of feudalism and saying, we've got to get past this. This is what Professor Michael Hudson talks about and others talk about. We in the West were moving away from a parasite-driven system, and that's when all the industrial gains were happening in the West and the improvements in standard of living and growth of wealth. But there was a counter-revolution. The parasites struck back. Professor Hudson talks about this over and over. Starting in the late 1800s, the Wendigo parasites said, hey, we're losing a good thing here. We've got to reimpose philosophies and arguments and false narratives that say, no, our way is the best way. Our way is the virtuous way. The parasites struck back. They basically have choked off industry in the West. It was growing based on these anti-parasitical ideas like the American system of Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. But the parasites struck back. They got the upper hand. They are morally bankrupt, and their morally bankrupt system has hollowed out the West to the point that these parasites are unable to accomplish their goal of hopping over to China and taking over its industry the way they have done so many times before. This is the apocalypse of the parasites, and they are screaming. They are just foaming at the mouth with rage and trying everything they can, and they are getting their teeth broken on the industrial power of countries that have not let those financial parasites get the upper hand, specifically China and Russia and Iran. And I'm not saying that I don't believe in the United States of America and the Constitution. I'm saying that I do. It was built on a rejection of parasites. And that's what the American system was all about. In fact, that's what West Point was all about. Lincoln's system was about a national bank to fund national infrastructure and to protect the industry of a growing nation. And that national infrastructure was built largely by West Point graduates in the 1800s. West Point graduates built the canals and the railroads and the early roads of the United States. It's not the fault of the people of the West. It's the fault of these parasites. Those parasites are getting their comeuppance, and they're foaming at the mouth with rage. And it may be quite ugly what happens, but those parasites need to be brought down because their whole method of operation is to devour nations and to devour men and women. And so the men and women of the nations need to recognize this and reject those false narratives of those parasites, see through them, reject them, and bring an end to this parasitical devouring of the world. And that's what's happening right now.